We have Tesh of the American Immigration Council, with whom we're co-hosting this online workshop. She's the senior manager of the education program there and a former public school teacher. She designs programs that empowers educators and students to deliberate on important issues around immigration. We also have Eileen Kugler of Embrace Diverse Schools. There she works to strengthen diverse communities through her dynamic keynotes, engaging training programs, and comprehensive consulting. She has 25 years of experience in this field, and she's written 2 books on successful educators and educational enhancements, Debunking the Middle Class Myth, Why Diverse Schools Are Good for Kids, and Innovative Voices in Education, Engaging Diverse Communities. And we have someone from my neck of the woods, Dana Brown, who is the just retired principal, as in just retired, of Malden High School, the most diverse high school in all of Massachusetts, where he served for 13 years. He was also just selected as the 2016 Massachusetts Principal of the Year. Welcome to all of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, so it seems as though we can hear and see all of you. And let me just bring up my notes. I wanted to, first of all, really get into the idea of why we need to do this. Why is it important to debunk myths? We know that there's a lot of political rhetoric, misinformation being propagated out there, the internet, social media, blogs, talk shows, radio shows, news sources, giving rise to some very, very loud voices conflating immigration with many other different topics that they're really not related to. And through yesterday's modules, we learned through the research and the stories that we see the inherent value of having immigrants in our society, that this has been American history and it continues to today, and that diversity is a strength. It's something to be capitalized on. And the last point of why it's important to do this, I think, is that it leads to better outcomes, not just in terms of the classrooms, but in terms of families and communities and local economies. Claire, Eileen, don't you agree with this? Why is it important in the classroom and the school community?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that school is kind of a beacon of hope and a place where people should feel safe. I think that when teachers understand, everyone's journey and what they're trying to accomplish, it, benefits the entire community. One thing that I found is that when students understand the history of their community and how immigrants have impacted that, it makes them understand how to move forward.
And I've seen in communities where diversity is indeed viewed as a strength, and it's challenging. It can't just be some nice little piece of rhetoric. Oh, this is diversity. We love it here. You need to really take some actions and be willing to compromise and be willing to listen to other people. And when that happens, that's when the magic happens. And I've seen schools be this amazing place where it all begins, where the kids start to get to know each other, where adults in the community, when they're welcomed in, get to know children and families of different cultures, and the entire community is strengthened.
But you're talking about things, changes that are happening, and the ability to embrace these changes, and welcoming initiatives weren't always around. These are things that sort of have to crop up. And Dana, I want you to sort of set the stage for us in terms of the changes that have happened in Malden, in its history, in the history of Malden High School. What are the changes that have happened? What have remained the same? And how has both the community and school reacted to this? And perhaps what has been the impact of these changes?
Sure. 1977, I graduated from Malden High School, and our school population was 99.5% white middle class, mainly Jewish, Italian, Irish. Fast forward to 2016, we are now the most diverse high school in the state, 29% Caucasian, 24% Asian, 20% Hispanic, 24% Black. So a pretty balanced mix of students. Socioeconomically, we are poorer than we were 40 years ago. But what hasn't changed is the community that Malden is. We are a welcoming community. We have many places of worship, many places of faiths. We have a lot of cultural restaurants. We have gathering places for our immigrant families. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure it's been intentional, but we welcome families. We're close to Boston. People find lower rents here. They find more job opportunities being close to Boston. And we get along at Malden High School, and it's fascinating to watch on a daily basis. These are the students we have, and I think folks spend way too much time in denial, and they spend way too much time, looking back at the good old days or the olden days when I went to school. So I think really the two teachers said it best. We just have to look at our students as being from a strength-based point of view and not bringing their weaknesses to us. Every student has challenges, doesn't matter their race or culture, but every student has strengths, and we try to look at our students from a strength-based.
And, Malden is just an incredible microcosm of the diversity of Massachusetts, which also, it's not dominated by any particular country of origin when it comes to immigrants. You say that the community has sort of traditionally been welcoming, but that's obviously not the case in a lot of places. And I think maybe, you and Eileen perhaps can talk a lot about the myths that have been propagated or that exist in your community dealing with the particular immigrant groups that you have. Eileen, you want to start?
Yeah, I do, and I want to add the point that there's an increasing body of research that shows that not only is it important to value immigrant students and families because it's important for them, but it's also important for everyone around them. I'm really excited you mentioned my two books. Back in 2002, based on my experience and the experience of many other educators around the country that I talked to, the whole point of that book was that we all benefit. Every child of every background benefits from being in a diverse school. And now there is, again, increasing research. I just heard the Secretary of Education basically say that identical thing. He has a whole initiative called Stronger Together, where we all will be working for the betterment of every student, which means increasing diversity, which means working toward integration. We're resegregating our schools. We're not, but communities, socioeconomically, schools are becoming more segregated rather than less. And there is now a deep recognition that's not good for anyone, that every student has something to learn from every other student. Those strengths that you just discussed are brought into the school, and every other child benefits from those.
Right, and I know, Tatyana, you had mentioned in your presentation just now sort of some of the outcomes of engaging with your students, whether they're documented or not. And as Eileen pointed out, there's a lot of research on this. Maybe you just want to list some of the outcomes, not just for the student, but also for the community, for the state, for the nation at large, for teachers doing this.
I'm sorry, I was putting my mic back on and it was telling me that my mic was back on, so I didn't hear the very first part.
Well, just about what are the outcomes of these kinds of initiatives to engage with immigrant students and parents, both on the small scale and the big scale? What is the impact that this ultimately has?
Sure. Well, on the biggest scale, I would say the most impactful policy that we have is DACA, right? It's actually not a policy, it's a program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And with that, we know that more students are finding jobs that are aligned to their skills and their education. We know that they're driving, which, in New York City, driving is not a big deal, but driving in other states means you can go to college. It means you can have different types of employment opportunities. They're opening bank accounts and they're able to support their families more. So on a policy scale, that's huge. Then we can go all the way down to the individual scale, right? When students have this information, they're empowered. right? So they know what what they can and can't do. And it's not just like what you said, these quick sound bites, like, oh, you're a rapist, you're a murderer, but it's no, the discourse has to be like, you can go to school. You have these amazing resources that we need in this country because, we lack them so tremendously. And then that kind of funnels down to their family and their siblings and things like that. So I think the sense of giving students access to the most accurate information and showing them the strengths that they have really can change their life, right? Because if you incorrectly tell a child you can't go to college, you have now changed the course of their life and their life chances. So, and that's not to say like if they're going to go to college, they can necessarily work in that field, but it's still something, right? It's still going to change their opportunity. So I think we, as educators, can do things in very big and small ways to impact our students.
All right, so keeping it right there, Tatyana, and I will go to Dana afterwards. Give us some of those concrete strategies. Give us some of those ways of engaging with immigrant students in your experience. And we have a question about, how is it Malden High School did such a great job? So I'll move to Dana afterwards. But what are some strategies that other educators can implement?
Right. So first of all, I think we have to talk about this. And I think we have to talk about this in formal and in informal ways. So when we do a unit on immigration, which we all do, we have to talk about current immigration issues. We have to look at current policies that are taking place. And we have to, have our students' stories, kind of as Claire was saying, we have to give them space to tell their stories as well. But then, for example, when we're giving students information about scholarships, we need to mention, by the way, this is for undocumented students and this is not for undocumented students, because we don't know in our classes. We may know some of the students, but we may not know all of the students. So I think it's creating these spaces. I saw somebody else put up a comment that they have stickers like that, like kind of signifies that you're an ally and this is a safe space. I will put a side note that when we create these quote unquote safe spaces, what that implies is the other spaces are unsafe. And so we want to move to an all-around safe space, right, where we don't even have to talk about safe spaces because it's implied. But in the meantime, we're not in a safe place for immigrants in this country. We're in a very dangerous place. So we need to make this heard, and we need to have them be seen and heard in formal and in curriculum and in informal ways too, in counseling and forming our school guidance counselors. So when students start applying for college and they start becoming kind of depressed or withdrawn, and this is a top student, there's probably a reason behind it, right? So digging a little bit deeper. So those are just some ideas. I'm sure there's many more out there.
Dana, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I love the idea of talking about this and being very transparent about this in everything we do. At Malden High School, we reach out to folks who can come into Malden High School and speak to our undocumented students about going to college, about financial aid, about the private colleges and universities in New England who appear to be more helpful to undocumented students than others, who will give them better financial aid packages than others will. We've taken some visits to colleges with some of our students to show them the campus and to introduce them to financial aid staff and admission staff and say, it's not all bad news. There are people out in the world who will help you. And this has been very helpful to us. But I think around the cultural piece, talking about it is so fascinating because we learn as much as the students learn. And we talk a lot about our students who are living in two cultures. They're living in their own culture and they're trying to live in the American school culture. And that's so helpful for our faculty and staff to learn about what it's like for these students to be living in their own cultures and then trying to live in the American school culture. And then they can make some, adaptations to what they're doing in the classroom, what they're doing around parent meetings, what they're doing around reaching out to parents. So it's a totally transparent process and not being afraid to talk about the issues facing all students.
And
Can I build
Claire,
on-
I just want to go to Claire for a second. We're talking about adults, we're talking about college, we're talking about high school, but what about early learners?
Well, I think there's three different kind of myths that kind of start in elementary is, the language obstacles. that if students are only speaking their native language at home, then it's going to translate in the classroom as an obstacle for them to learn. Also, the myth of, parents, they don't want to get involved, or in their culture, they're not supposed to be engaged with the school. And then lastly, that myth of, well, immigrants today are different than immigrants of the yesteryear. So I think that these are really important. And I do see, questions about language coming up, and, that testing's probably not going to go away, but one strategy, especially in early childhood, is to start, teaching vocabulary that's high frequency academic words. And I have some resources for that. Also, making sure that the classroom is not an English only zone, like letting students feel comfortable, and then also engaging parents. Parents do want to get involved. Everyone's kind of in a different point of the journey and may have different comfort levels, but there are strategies in early childhood, I'm talking about K through 5, to make sure that students and parents, as well as the teachers in the classroom, can succeed.
And as you talk about K through 5, I just wanted to share a little thing here. I was invited to talk to some second graders at the Linden STEAM Academy. That's science, technology, engineering. Dana, you can help me out here.
Yes, art and math. Science,
art and math.
Engineering, art and math.
It was a Meet an Immigrant Day, and they were very, very excited to talk to someone from a different country, even though they themselves are from all around the world. And when I said my name, Denzil Mohammed, a young Somali boy, you'll see him on the ground there on the right, jumped up and said, "My name is Mohammed." I was so thrilled to say that. But I know, Eileen, you wanted to jump in here, and specifically about immigrant parents. What are some of the myths around immigrant parents? I think we mentioned them a little bit earlier in yesterday's module, that they, it's not that they don't want to engage with the schools, it's just they come from a culture where you send your child to school and you go to work and you pick your child up and that's it, right?
Well, that's a piece of it. And Claire, I didn't mean to step on your turn, but there are a number of myths that, as I mentioned, it's critically important to have families engaged. And it's interesting, Dana was talking about how the students they have a foot in two worlds. And I think one of the ways we can help the students is by relating to the parents, by bringing them in, by listening to them, not only just the students, but for many of the families, they don't know how to get involved. And there are a lot of challenges in involving immigrant families, and it leads to a number of myths. And the first one is they don't care, which every single person here who's ever worked with an immigrant family knows that is the farthest thing from the truth. They come here, they give up everything to come to the United States for their family, and education is a core piece of that. So they do care about education. And then it leads to another myth of, well, they don't really want to be involved. And I think there is the cultural piece that, or even the fact, more than culture, I've worked with many immigrant families, and when I say, in your home country, are you expected to be a part of school? Were your parents expected to be a part of school? And they all say, absolutely not. So it's experience in addition to culture. And we in the education community don't often do the work to say, you are welcome, you are valued, you are invited to be here, because they think they're not supposed to come. And I remember in one group I said, if you don't go to a back to school night, the rest of the year, the educators think you don't care. And they were shocked. They had no idea. So part of it is simply building that partnership. And that leads to another one of the myths, which is that all a school has to do is provide information. We just have to tell them when the meetings are. We have to translate it into Spanish or whatever language in the community. We have to just tell them how to be good parents and tell them how the American system works. That's not how you build a partnership. That's really not providing the educators with the support and the knowledge. And not only does every student have strength, but every family member, every parent or guardian has strength. And to be supportive of the educators, we all need to make sure that the families have the opportunities to be authentic partners and be valued. and to have their funds of knowledge recognized. So the schools need to build this, and as part of it, we're putting a lot of responsibility on educators. They also need training. There's a lot of discussion in the parent community, the parent engagement community, about dual capacity building. Not only building the capacity of parents to be advocates and mentors and supporters, but building the capacity of teachers, of school leadership to engage families in ways that have meaning. I've seen this work. I was just at a meeting at the Department of Education that was absolutely mind-blowing. It was called Parent Camp International, and it was all immigrant parent leaders who had come to this meeting not to listen to anyone. At Parent Camp, there are no brought-in experts. They're all the experts. And there were workshops where they were all encouraged to provide their own point of view, their own perspective, their own ideas. It was amazing. And how did those parents get there? Because there were school systems that supported them, that trained them, that recognized that many families do have the capacity to get more involved and to become leaders of their own communities, of the school community, of all families. But it takes a recognition that immigrant families have a lot to bring to the school.
So you bring up 3 good points there, and I want to go to Dana for a couple of them, and also to Tatyana about the parent engagement. What has Malden High School done that is perhaps different? We have to think outside the box. You're teaching evolving classrooms that are changing over time. Traditional teaching methods, traditional curriculums, traditional engagement methods just won't work. What has Malden High School done in terms of both parent engagement and teacher training? And then I want to talk to Tatyana a little bit about, Eileen just brought up empowering students and parents and leadership. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that. So Dana?
So I think the teacher engagement piece is very interesting, administrator engagement piece. I think it's not always about parents coming to the school. Sometimes it's about educators going out into the community. And we really encourage our staff to do that in Malden. Malden's a very small community. We're 2 miles by 3 miles. So it's not this huge piece of land. It's very tiny. And it's jammed with 60,000 people, mostly immigrants. But we encourage our staff, and I tried to lead the way by, going to the Haitian church and going to the Chinese church and going to Kinsey celebrations. And when parents invite you to parties and festivals and multicultural events, you leave the school and you go to where they're comfortable and you engage with them where they're comfortable. And when you build those relationships, they will then start asking you questions about school and their children and how to get more involved in the school. So we really do put a lot of focus in Malden on going and meeting people where they are, rather than always expecting people to walk in the doors of the school. That comes eventually, but it doesn't always start that way.
And Tatyana, about empowering the students themselves, we're talking about teachers having to find ways to engage with them and debunk some of these myths. But once you empower the students, they can have a voice and go out there and do some of this work themselves.
Absolutely. So I think something that's really important is preparing students to be leaders. So public speaking, for example. So something I do whenever we show the film is I try not to go by myself, because me just showing the film is not enough. Me bringing students who have lived this situation is really important. And for some of them, they go with me for the first time to share their story in front of 30, 40, 50 people. And sometimes they're so nervous. As you know, public speaking, I think it makes everyone nervous, but especially something so sensitive. But what they find once they start sharing their story is how many people connect to it, how it helps other people, and how then they start feeling empowered. And that kind of ripples in other aspects of their lives. So I think speaking to college students, for example, speaking to high school students, I love how you went to the school and the other student had the same name as you. So seeing themselves as leaders and as mentors. So something we're doing with our dream team is we are right across the street from a high school. So we are going to set up like a mentoring for our undocumented students with their undocumented students so that they can guide them into going to college and things like that. So I think it's really important. First of all, it's an important life skill for all all students to be leaders, but especially for immigrant students, because it should be their voices that are at the forefront, and us as, supporting them and helping them to guide that path, lead that path.
Claire, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I totally agree. And I think that you can actually start that process at a very young age. Also, in terms of leadership, when parents see other parents engaging, then they see kind of their permission to engage. And it does take, several invitations at times. Also, letting the students, invite their parents, finding the type of communication that's best. Is it a written notice? Some parents want important or urgent. Sometimes you may have to translate notes, and a lot of parents do have phones and mobile devices and are now using Twitter. I think also just looking in the comments, that immigrants are not educated and can't help their students is definitely a misconception. The immigrant population is very similar to the U.S. population, where there's variations in levels of education. Also, just because students are reading different languages or listening to different languages at home, as I said before, it's actually a benefit. There's studies that show that these students have more cognitive development. They're able to transfer skills, in their lives. They're actually being able to be bilingual. It's going to help in their academic life, and their emotions. Being able to communicate with their parents is really, it's not just a cultural connection, but because language is more than just words. This is like a repository of memories, so that they have a connection to their parents and to their heritage. That heritage language at home is also a sense of pride. And then let's just face it, it's a global success. Being able to speak different languages, not just in the classroom, but home and beyond, is definitely a benefit.
So, we've talked about, so the cat was practicing on the piano, and now he's come to join us. That's good. I think he might have something to add, or maybe just want to give us some background music. Storytelling, engaging with the students, a lot of the myths surrounding parents. One of the things that was great in talking to those second graders is that they didn't expect to find commonalities. They expected, what's your favorite food? To hear about something exotic. Well, I said pasta. They're like, oh, me too, mac and cheese. And, the storytelling is excellent. Are there other strategies that you can use within the classroom to, we're debunking these myths, and how can this new information be used in the classroom or in the curriculum, in your teaching, in community activities, perhaps? Anyone want to jump in?
Can I address that? Just give one example. I saw in the comments that somebody wrote about teaching adults. And I'm thinking this is maybe not at the college level. Often adults, adult immigrants sometimes are in ESL classes, right? English as a second language classes. Also, I do want us to be careful with conflating immigrants and non-English speakers or people learning English. There are many immigrants, for example, that mostly speak English, that don't even speak their home language anymore. So, and also students in the United States who are labeled as English language learners, the majority of them are actually not immigrants. So just to kind of be aware of how we use those labels. But something I do want to point out is that we can use these English classes in very powerful ways. So instead of just talking about where is the library, use these English classes by teaching these adults about their rights. And then how to advocate for themselves. So instead of doing a role play about going to the grocery store and where's the bread, doing a role play about, going to your landlord and demanding that they fix the heat and that's your right to have that, So looking at what is your right if you're, for example, undocumented, and what can you demand and what can you not demand? What happens if you go to the police to report a crime, things like that. So I think we can still teach English to adults, which we often do, but do it through a way that gives them the power of understanding what their human rights are, even if they don't have rights of being a citizen, but they have human rights in this country. And so using that as well.
So one of the things you talked about in the classroom, and I used the example of our chorus teacher who, teaches 150 students every year from all over the world. And so his music selections reflect that at all of our concerts, the winter concert, the spring concert. It's not a traditional, American folk song concert. It's music from all over the world that reflects where these students come from. And I think that is a highlight for us, because that's one way that attracts parents into the school when they get to hear music from all over the world, and they can relate some to that.
And also, I think, we've talked a lot about building relationships, which is a critical piece of all of this. It's the foundation of it. But to really engage families, and you talked about it before, Dana, in a way that is valuable to the student, then the engagement needs to also be involving academics and providing these families with, I know some of the questioners on this, some of the comments related to this, how do you navigate an American system? What are the expectations? What does a report card really mean? And there's a lot of discussion right now about providing families with information about how their child is doing in relation to the class. So many times parents will get the information, but your child's doing fine. They don't know what fine means. They don't know what good means. Could they be doing better? Are we dealing with pity? Oh, well, you don't really have the time to work with your child, and you don't really, it's your child's just doing fine for your child. Or should we be holding the child to higher expectations, which is a key to the achievement gap, reducing the achievement gap? So empowering parents and other family members to be mentors, to be advocates, to have the same opportunities. If there's a program, an enrichment program, do the immigrant families really know that this is for their child too, that these are important opportunities for their child? So that's part of a critical piece of parent engagement, is really building their capacity to be actively involved and understand, as middle-class families who are American-born often do, to understand how the system works, to give them the privilege of being involved and being active and being supportive of their children.
I want to look at some of the questions and comments in the chat box, and I'll have maybe just one or two follow-up questions after that. But feel free to ask your questions in the chat box right now. We have about 10 more minutes for this discussion. And one of the questions, and this is a good point from Eliza, is, her name sounds familiar to me, the importance of creating the space to discuss diversity instead of simply celebrating it. Celebrating is a word that I don't particularly like, so what does it mean? How is it done? And especially given the context of the immigration discussion in America today, how do you really create those safe spaces to talk about, to really discuss diversity? And maybe it sort of leads on to one of my questions to like Dana and Eileen about creating that culture within a school of wanting to do this, of seeing the need to do this. How do you create that school culture among staff as well as students? Any ideas? Tatyana, you must have ideas.
Yeah, do you want to address it first? Because you're doing it.
Go ahead. I will defer to Tatyana.
Oh, goodness. So I totally agree with this. We often talk about diversity, like what Sonia Nietsu refers to as sunny side up diversity. Like just looking at the fluffy stuff, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, not talking about the more critical and difficult aspects and problematic aspects. I mean, all we need to do is turn on the news and see, talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and Black men, but not only Black men being killed. And this is all happening. And we have a curriculum, but we can't avoid the reality of what's happening. So I think bringing in current events, right? Having students look at these topics, create, share their opinion, but also look at different perspectives, right? We talked about in the beginning that people were bombarded with information, but it's information in very small chunks, right? Like it's a Twitter blurb of 132 lines or whatever. I have to correct that, but it's a hashtag or something else, but there's so much more to it. So having students look, for example, at different perspectives from the media and discuss that. That's really important. So I think we have to bring in current events, but before we do that, we have to create a space where students can differ in their opinions. And that's something about creating the culture of the classroom and the culture of the school. And for example, when talking about something I will put like a little asterisk about is debates, especially when it comes to issues around undocumented immigrants. So if you, for example, are going to set up a debate in your classroom, should or shouldn't we send back the almost 12 million undocumented immigrants, you don't know who's who. And if you're going to be putting a student in a position to say, we should send back all of these immigrants, that's a very uncomfortable and unsafe position for the student to be in. So I think we have to think really carefully about creating these conversations where students' voices can be heard, but yet even they can be safe as well. So that's just, it's a really big topic, but I think it's so important that celebration or affirming diversity, it's important, but it's not enough in this world that we live in, especially now with the elections coming up as well.
And also, I know you had a speaker on this on yesterday's program, the whole idea of introspection by faculty. When I go in and work with faculty on school improvement and on school culture that undergirds all of the things that we're talking about, it really begins with introspection. And no one works harder than teachers and principals and everyone in a school. They're always working every single day. They rarely take the time to sit back and think. And that's how you create a positive school culture, to look at what's going on, to look at who you are. What do you bring into the room? Every one of us has an individual culture that's very complex, that involves our experiences, our family life, where we grew up, what side of town, what side of the street. You bring it into the classroom. And unless you examine that and what are the assumptions that come from that, and I'm not saying you're bad, I'm not saying you have, you're biased, you're prejudiced, nobody wants to be, but what is it that you're not even thinking about when you bring it into the classroom? And that, I think, is the beginning of creating a culture where the first honest dialogues are among the faculty, and then you can engage the students, and then you can bring in the parents. And as many of us have been saying, that's how you move forward. You can't shove it under the rug. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. You can't just celebrate holidays. You have to have honest dialogues, because there are too many myths out there that people are bombarded with.
And Dana, as a principal, we spoke a little bit about this the other day. How did you get your staff involved? I know it's a calling, it's a love for the job, a love for their students, but beyond that, as a principal, perhaps you can suggest, different things to create that culture that we're talking about among staff.
So I think first and foremost, you have to be honest. And we talk a lot at Malden High School and have been doing some training the last couple of years around triggers. And we talk about triggers for adults as well as triggers for our students. We've done a lot of training around social and emotional wellness. And we want teachers to understand that they bring certain perspectives to the job, and students bring certain perspectives to their work every day as students. And we have to talk about them openly. And so we had teachers being honest about their triggers. Students who wear their pants down, or students who have their hats on backwards, or students who come in late to their classroom every day, or students who talk too much to students at their locker and cause them to be late. So when we started talking about all these triggers for adults, it really raised the awareness of who was coming into our house every day, who was coming into our school every day, and what we had to do as adults to understand our own emotions and biases before we could work with our students. And we've been doing this now for about 3 years, and it's really helped open the communication. We had a mock election this year. We had a presidential debate this year that was very successful with a Trump-like candidate and a Clinton-like candidate. And it was very successful because our students are used to talking openly and transparently without feeling that their opinions are going to be put down or laughed at, or somehow they'd be violated. So it's taken a long time to build that culture. It doesn't happen overnight. And the other thing I will say, it can go away in a minute. And so it never ends. You always have to be working on that piece.
And we just have about 3 more minutes, and I want to ask just 1 or 2 more questions. And the first one will be to Claire and Eileen. Specifically you, Claire, in your experience of not just being a teacher, but now training teachers, going out across the country, teachers have the world of things to worry about, all these trainings, all these things to keep updated with. They're bombarded by professional development like this. What do you say to encourage them to, you need to make, it's not that you need to reinvent the wheel, it's not that you need to devote so many more hours to this necessarily. It's just an adjustment of technique, perhaps. What do you say to encourage them and give them that morale?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's ways to insert this into what you are already doing. For instance, one way to really think about diversity is through storytelling. And of course, that's part of the curriculum. Looking at different charts and graphs of, points in history, that could be a math lesson. Science, talk about, the assets that immigrants have contributed, and starting at an early age. I also know that looking at some of the comments, people don't think that this can be done in high school. It definitely can be done in high school. In fact, using the high school and developing leaders, this is something that we've been doing. Have high school students, work with elementary students, or have high school students, instead of doing a debate, learn how to deliberate, where everyone has a chance to speak and listen to one another, and then really try, get them to dig into true information and facts. We do have a lot of that material, and we'll post that for you. I wish we had more time.
And I would just add that one of the myths out there is that engaging families is simply a time drain, that you do it when everything else is done and your test scores are up and school culture is great. Okay, now we'll engage the families. When it's an integral part of it all. It's an integral part of student success, of building your community, of strengthening the student's identity, of building a stronger community. It's not easy. It does take time, and teachers and educational leaders deserve to have professional development on this, but it's an integral part of everything that goes on. And just listening to Dana talk about all the things that he's done in his school, and you see the results. It works. To have a strong leader who is committed to these issues of building relationships, engaging students, valuing families, it works.
All right, so I'm going to ask one final question before we close off this panel. This has been a really good discussion. We covered a lot of areas, and I think we have a lot of discussion going on in the chat box, as you see. I think my final question to you is just, each of you, 10 seconds, give probably the most promising strategy of engaging with parents or students or other staff members. If you had one suggestion to make that the participants can adopt, what would it be? Let's start with you, Tatyana.
I would just say to keep in mind that schools are a microcosm of society, and bring the society to school.
Dana?
I would say, as a leader in a school, it's all about hiring the right people to work in your school.
As an educator, share what you know. Your peers, sometimes, you can share knowledge. So make sure not to silo yourself.
And I would say recognize parents as a resource, as a strength, rather than something you have to do at the end of the day, but that they can be your partners and really valuable partners.
Okay, so I hope that everyone got those. We are jotting down points like crazy because so many great ideas came out of this. Thank you very much to Dr. Tatyana Kleyn, Principal David Brown, Eileen Kugler, and of course Claire Tesh, who I think you should probably give us a little bit of a preview of your panel discussion, which is coming up in an hour or so.
Yeah, so later this afternoon, we'll be talking about some of the strategies for, alternative strategies for engaging parents and students.